Welcome everyone to our election week seminar in our Center for Evolution and Medicine. It is my great joy to introduce Mallika Sarma, Dr. Mallika Sarma, an expert in human adaptation to extreme and novel environments. And importantly, I think now more than ever, she also studies the capacities for adaptive resilience in the face of stress. Dr. Sarma earned her BS in Anthropology and Psychology at the University of Michigan before going on to join the debut PhD program in anthropology at Notre Dame. Dr. Sarma is now an NIH Ruth L. Kirstein postdoc in the Human Spaceflight Lab at Johns Hopkins Medical School. She has earned multiple awards for her research and her teaching, and has conducted field research in Nepal, in the Republic of the Congo, and domestically in the Rockies with the National Outdoor Leadership School, most commonly referred to as NOLS. Today, she will be talking to us about To Infinity and Beyond, Human Biology and Evolution in the Time of Human Spaceflight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarma to our institution for this incredible talk, and take it away, Dr. Sarma.
Thank you so much, Katie. I am really excited to be able to talk to all of you today. I am sorry that I can't be there in person, but it is the COVID year of pandemic, and so I guess that's how it goes. But things are pretty stressful here on Earth right now, so it's pretty exciting that I'll get to be able to take you out of this world talking a little bit about space. So today I have three major topics that I want to get through. The first is looking at human adaptation and evolution as we know it, and then connecting that to what happens to the human body in space. And finally, thinking about what are the things that we should be looking for when looking at human adaptation and evolution and the human body in space, connecting it all together. So first, I want you all to imagine this is the future. Now, the year is 2045, and we have humans on Mars. Over the past several decades, we have orbited the planet, we have put rovers on the surface, we've taken pictures of the landscape and the sediment, but right now, this is different. We have boots on the ground, honest to goodness, actual people on another planet. And do we know, under these extreme conditions, what might be happening to their bodies? Our species have taken a millennia to adapt to the many myriad environments here on Earth, but now we've put humans in a tin can, on a bomb, and dropped them off at a whole new planet that is decidedly not Earth, with some tools and some food. But we really need to know, how are they acclimating? How are they adapting to these environments? And what do we need to do to keep them alive? And these are the questions that I'm interested in my work, and so what I want to talk to you all about a little bit today. So first, the human capacity for adaptation and survival. We know that humans here on Earth have successfully survived for extended periods of times over generations in a range of environments and ecosystems, from high altitude environments to desert environments to extreme cold like circumpolar regions, and to environments that are resource abundant but with high parasitic and pathogenic burdens. Now, during these fantastic CEM seminars, I had the opportunity to watch some of your old videos. I know that you all have learned about the many ways that humans have successfully managed to live in these conditions. What is important to note is that the ways in which people survive, whether it's short-term acclimatization or long-term adaptation, is first multifaceted. There are multiple ways in which people are adapting and acclimating to the environment around them. The second is that it happens across different timescales. You'll have short-term acclimatization or long-term genetic changes that are happening in populations over generations. And the last thing is that it is dependent on the specific environmental and social context. Now, I want to highlight social context here because many times when, I guess if you're not a human biologist or not a biological anthropologist, when people are thinking about physiological changes, you don't automatically think about the social context as well. But this is relevant for really any social animal, but especially primates and particularly humans. Now, I want you to just keep this in mind as we move forward and talk about adaptation. So my overall question here is understanding how do humans survive and thrive in extreme environments? Now, let's look, if you think about these examples I gave before, let's look at high altitude populations as an example. So in a high altitude population, individuals face a series of stressors, including hypoxia, high solar radiation, cold, low humidity, high winds, limited nutrition base, and a rough terrain. Like, it is a really difficult environment to be in. For any of you who have spent extended time either trekking or, going to Denver, which actually does have some physiological impacts, you know how much of a struggle it can be. In a hypoxic environment, you're receiving approximately 35% less oxygen pressure than you are at sea level. Now, high altitude adaptations are one of the best possible adaptations that we can look at that highlights the earlier principles I was talking about. It's also probably my favorite case study because what is pretty amazing is that much of what we understand about high altitude adaptation works best when understood from an evolutionary and bioanthropological perspective. So if you have not had the chance, I really recommend reading Cynthia Bell's work. She's done a really excellent job in synthesizing massive amounts of work that has been done by human biologists and others looking at high altitude adaptation. So, okay, what exactly is happening in high altitude adaptation? So first we are going to look at resident populations. There are 4 regions in the world that have populations that have been living at high altitude for long enough periods of time that you're actually seeing physiological implications. So in order of how long human populations have lived there, we have the Ethiopian highlands, the Tibetan plateau, so where the Himalayas are, the Andes, and the Rocky Mountains. Now, the Rocky Mountains, just as a caveat, we have had people living in the Rocky Mountains, and you do see physiological changes, but the longer term genetic changes you're seeing are more in the Ethiopian populations among the Amhara, the Tibetan populations, as well as in the Andes. So in residence, what you see is an activation of the HIF pathway, which is a genetic pathway that assists in oxygen consumption. The HIF pathway activation also differs by population. There are a series of really excellent genetic papers that I recommend that you read that cover this topic specifically. There are also physiological changes for increased oxygen consumption, including increased resting ventilation, increased hypoxic ventilatory response, and increased levels of nitric oxide. And this also depends by population, where you see higher levels in Tibetans than Andeans that are in the same elevation. You also see decreased hemoglobin in the Tibetan and Amhara populations. Amhara are the Ethiopian populations, and increased hemoglobin in the Andean populations. So what I want to highlight right here is that depending on the factors, like where the population is or how long they've been exposed to a stressor, it shapes the actual adaptations that are happening. Now for sojourner populations, so this is like, hello, I live in Indiana, I live in Maryland, and I'm going to go and now live in the Rocky Mountains. I'm going to go live in the Himalayas. I'm going to go live in the Andes for an extended period of time. I'm going to go trek there, etc. These are the changes that we're seeing right there. So what we see is that there's an increased rate and depth of pulmonary ventilation, as well as stimulated sympathoadrenal response. And individuals are at risk for chronic hypocapnia, which is chronic low carbon dioxide, as well as acute mountain sickness and general pulmonary disease. So what is special about looking at high altitude adaptation, acclimatization, accommodation, etc., is that it really highlights our 3 principles of how humans are responding to the environment, where you see first that it is multifaceted. And second, that it differs across timescales. So depending on how long a population has been in that particular environment, you're seeing very specific changes, which goes into our 3rd concept, that it is dependent on specific environmental and social context. Also, what I'm not including here in this very general review of high altitude adaptation, I feel like that is a whole lecture in and of itself, but what I'm not including here are any cultural or technological changes, ranging from oxygen tanks or domestication of these yak cow hybrids that you can use for labor or calorie production, or something as simple as like wearing a jacket. Our access to these technological or cultural or whatever kind of resources you want to call it also contributes to how we are going to respond to these stressors. It is not just an individual body on its own, but all of the accoutrements, all of the resources that come with it. Which brings us to how we want to theoretically situate ourselves when we're thinking about these adaptation questions. So if I were with you guys, like if we were sitting in an audience and I could see your faces, I would ask for a show of hands of who all have heard of the extended evolutionary synthesis. This paper, the Leyland paper, is really fantastic, excellent. It was a cornerstone of my own biological anthropology training. And it really builds on what our concepts of evolution is and how we should be approaching how humans, how any organism really is responding to their environment. Now it's building off of Darwin and Wallace's original theories of evolution and the modern synthesis, which had added in Mendelian genetics. And the extended evolutionary synthesis introduces this different, more holistic perspective to how organisms are changing. Okay. So I will save you the trouble of reading this whole paper. I'm going to break down these 6 core assumptions that are part of the paper that are going to shape the way that we're going to be looking at things moving forward. So the first assumption is that there is reciprocal causation. So organisms shape and are then shaped by selective and developmental environments. So the organism, it does not exist on its own, just responding to a static environment. They are also then shaping the environment themselves, similar to concepts of niche construction. The second is inclusive inheritance. So this is broadening our ideas of how individuals inherit traits, inherit characteristics. So it's extending beyond genes, but and also includes transgenerational and epigenetic inheritance, which I'm sure that many of you in the audience know well enough about. Physiological inheritance, ecological inheritance, as well as social behavioral transmission and in cultural inheritance. When we're thinking about things like how a nation is responding to a disease like COVID-19. That is something you can think about in terms of ecological inheritance as well as social and behavioral transmission. How are people behaving? How is the environment around you changing? What are the heritable traits you are passing down from generation to generation? The third assumption is non-random phenotypic variation. So developmental bias, which is resulting from non-random mutations or phenotypic accommodation, means that some phenotypic variants are more likely than others compared to a random emergence of phenotypic variation. So there might be some directionality there based on what the actual context is. The fourth assumption is variable rates of change. So in previous assumptions of the modern synthesis, the idea was that all change, all evolutionary change was going to happen very, very gradually. But the extended evolutionary synthesis introduces the idea that change is not necessarily gradual. Variants of large effects are possible, allowing for rapid evolutionary change. And so, you know, going back to your original bioanth class, your original genetics class, things like the founder's effect, if you're thinking about sending people to really extreme environments that are going to have rapid impacts on an individual body, on individual behavior, thinking about the variable rates of change becomes really important. The fifth core assumption is that taking an organism-centered perspective. So instead of looking at individual genes, which we should be considering the whole organism in completion, because developmental systems can facilitate adaptive variation and modify selective environments, the evolutionary process and the concepts of inheritance are now broadened extensively. And the final assumption is macroevolution. So additional evolutionary processes, including developmental bias and ecological inheritance, help explain macroevolutionary patterns and contribute to evolvability. So that's a lot of theory that I just dumped on everyone's heads. But the important concepts that I want you to take away from it is that evolution, how we think about how people change, is much, much more complicated than what we may have learned in elementary school, looking at Mendelian genetics or just natural selection in and of itself. So these theoretical frameworks now shape how we can then answer this original question of how humans are surviving and thriving in extreme environments. And I want you to keep all these factors in mind when we're thinking about what exactly is happening to the human body in space. And as we're thinking about it here, space is just another extreme environment that the organism, and so in this case, a human, has to adapt to. So thinking about it within the spectrum of ecologies, a spectrum of environments that a human body can then adapt and respond to. Okay, so spaceflight is not an easy environment. It's really brutal on your body to be in a spaceflight environment. You have medical professionals in high altitude medicine, hyperbaric medicine, aerospace medicine, space medicine, who've all been working over decades to try and get a handle on like what exactly is happening to the human body. If anyone is interested, NASA actually has a couple of reports from Skylab, like back in the 70s, of like a very, very substantial report on all of the different changes that are happening to the human body. And people have continued to look at that kind of information, but it is a very, very harsh environment. And I just want to clarify really quick, we are talking about a human body within a human built structure. So we're not talking about a free floating body in space, because then the human would be dead. So we are talking about it within a structure that has life support systems, that has oxygen, etc. Now we know that the spaceflight environment impacts your brain, both structural and functional changes. And I would recommend, if anyone has any questions after, I have a really cool little GIF video that shows some of the structural changes that happen in the head area. The cardiovascular system, your bones and muscles, the gut microbiome, just among others. And so if you got the readings ahead of time, they do a really good job of breaking down like what are all the different parts of the human body that are being affected. But before we get into that, what we want to ask is like, what exactly is the spaceflight environment? Are we talking just not having gravity or microgravity, or is there more to it? Now, NASA has an entire group of people at the Human Research Program that are looking at questions like this. And they have broken it out into thinking about the 5 hazards of human spaceflight, and then the responses of the body that are relevant to those 5 hazards. I'd also like to say that the illustrations are all courtesy of NASA's Human Research Program. They're amazing, and they're all public domain. So I would recommend checking out their site. They have lots of videos and pictures and infographics and stuff. It's really great to see. Okay, the 5 hazards. So first, we have our gravity fields. It sounds very sci-fi-y, but what it basically means is that gravity here on Earth is very specific and very different to gravity in space, which is different from gravity on the moon, which is different from gravity on Mars. On Mars, you have about one third of Earth's gravity. On the moon, you have 1/6 of Earth's gravity, and it does all sorts of weird things to your body. It impacts your spatial orientation, your hand-eye coordination, your balance, locomotion, which if you are in microgravity doesn't actually really happen. Locomotion does change substantively if you are on the moon and eventually whenever we're on Mars, as well as bone and muscle loss. I think bone and muscle loss is one of the most well-studied phenomena that happen because you don't have gravity. So my PI actually makes this joke pretty often that just living every day, you are exercising because you live in a gravity-filled environment, and gravity is pulling down on your bones and your muscles. And so your bones and muscles are doing a lot of work to keep you upright and to not be collapsing on the ground. So just getting out of bed in the morning is a workout when you live in a gravity environment. Doesn't normally cut it when you go to the doctor and they're like, why haven't you worked out in days? But that's fine. Okay, so the next hazard is isolation and confinement. I think that this is something, as all of us who have been living in COVID-19 can really appreciate. So living in isolation and confinement leads to declines in mood, in cognition, declines in morale or interpersonal interaction. If you are on a crew with only 4 to 6 people, you don't get to see anyone else, it becomes really, really difficult. But there's also circadian rhythm dysfunction as well as nutritional deficiency. If you do not have access to all the nutrients you need, or you don't feel like eating, then it causes some real downstream effects on how your body is going to be able to function for however long you need to be in that environment. The third hazard is a hostile enclosed environment. I mean, most of this is like pretty cool sci-fi is stuff because we're talking about space anyways, but the hostile enclosed environment, I think, is when we can get into some like really weird sci-fi movies. There's a much easier transference of microbes and microorganisms from person to person when you're all in the same space together. Imagine you're in a tent with three of your best friends, actually not even your best friends, three of people that you go to work with, and you can bathe, kind of, you can try and clean yourself, but you can never leave the tent. The amount of microbes, of bacteria, of detritus that is floating around there is quite amazing. It is quite a lot. It also leads to increased stress hormone elevation, as well as immune system activation. And finally, we have space radiation. So space radiation, I think, is one of the scariest things that we are facing. When you are in a space flight environment, you encounter more than 10 times the radiation than you experience here on Earth. I know people always say, like, you get radiation from everything, you get radiation from a banana, but being in space does have a lot of radiation. When you're on Earth, you are protected by your atmosphere. Just another reason why, climate change, you want to do what you can to protect the ozone layer, because the solar radiation, space radiation, which are two different kinds of radiation, will fry your body. It leads to a damaged central nervous system, altered cognitive function, reduced motor function, behavioral changes. It's just not good. And that's something that is a real concern, trying to figure out how to protect the human body from radiation. Okay, and here's the actual last hazard, and that is distance from Earth. When you think about distance from Earth, it may not seem like it would be that hard. It's like, I'm an astronaut, I am someone who's in space, I'm okay. I don't have to be, if I can leave all of the craziness on Earth behind and go into space, that's fine. But the communication delays and limited to no opportunities of resupply can cause some serious issues, including psychological implications of being so far away from home. If you cannot contact people that you would normally contact, whether that is a subject matter expert or it is a loved one, how do you solve your problems? And then you have all of these other issues with behavioral changes, cognitive changes, brain structure changes, and you can't actually contact anyone to get help. What does that mean? The trip to Mars is going to be around 3 years. It'll take about a year and a half or so to get there. Then you land, you do some science, and then you come back. And that's a long time. The communication delay, depending on what your orbital, where you are in the orbits, can be anywhere between 3 to 21 minutes. That's a long time. And so that's just another hazard to think about, and how it's going to affect human biology, human behavior, and physiology. Just to make things even more complicated, we all know that, these systems are being affected, but for anyone here that's taking a biology class, your pre-med classes, psychology classes, you know that individual physiological and behavioral systems don't exist in isolation. They are actually likely all connected through various feedback loops that are vastly understudied. And so NASA now is starting to pay attention to this kind of integrative systems response. But it is something that I want to note that probably people in this group, biological anthropologists, human biologists, evolutionary medicine people, you are all very, very well equipped to answer these questions. The complex interaction is key to where we need to turn our understanding to. And I'm going to give an example of how we can potentially look at this kind of complex interaction to help start to answer our questions. Okay, this is another audience participation that we'll just pretend that we have participation right now. But do you see a tiny speck on this graph? And it's really hard, depending on how nice your computer screen is or how dirty your computer screen is, you may be able to see it. Well, that's Earth. Yeah, that's Earth from Mars. This is a rover picture from Mars, and that's how far away Earth is. It's also, I think, a pretty good approximate to comparing what we do know about the possibilities of what is going to actually happen to the human body as we become a spacefaring species. We know so little in the grand scheme of all of the information that we probably should know or we have the capacity to know. So where we're at right now is that science is really hard. Okay, science is just hard anywhere, but especially in space, it is really hard. And biology in humans on a whole different planet is even harder. What is the point of trying to figure out anything at all if it's just like too complex and too complicated to even bother with? Well, okay, we do have different ways to try and get at these questions. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this. There's this really famous saying that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So what space models do we have? Well, first we have our actual existing data looking at space flight. And so we have it from the Space Shuttle and Skylab, which are like the top two, the one on the top right, and then you can see the shuttle launching, as well as ISS. So actually, here's a fun fact. If you were born this week, in the year 2000 or anytime later, you have never lived without at least one human in space. We just celebrated the 20th anniversary of ISS. So that is very, very exciting. So even though these stints at space are still only models, because if we go back to what we had originally talked about, we know that the specific context of space and the time scale is going to make our adaptation of how our bodies are responding very, very different. But for the amount of research that needs to be done, like we can't just depend on sending people up to space. It's really expensive. It's really time consuming. Yes, we can send animal models as well, but we have to get a little bit more creative, which is where we come to looking at analogs. So there are a couple of famous analogs. There is Hera, which is a habitat that is built in Johnson Space Center in Texas. And it is built to be around the same size as International Space Station. People volunteer to be Hera participants and they go inside and they have to like pretend that they're actually in space for like 4 to 6 weeks, and they run psychological tests, they run immunological tests, they have them fill out surveys and do tasks and a lot of testing to see like what is actually going to happen to different people. We also have what I think is maybe the most popular of all the analogs, which is parabolic flight. So it is a really good approximate for microgravity because you're able, while you're in this airplane and you're going up and down, you're able to simulate microgravity for a brief moment in time. Then you can simulate high G's, so like, you know, landing force for a short period of time as well. It's also really fun from what I've heard. If anyone here is interested, you can pay $13,000 and you can get yourself a flight on a parabolic flight. I think it is 13. It's very expensive. But you can do also really, really good science on it, especially if you're interested in looking at the microgravity effects on whatever system it is. Then there's also things like if you're especially interested in isolation, looking at, you know, the Antarctica field station, Concordia station, anyone who has done really remote field work where you can't get in contact with anyone, you have to like become really dependent and really close with your crew members, can definitely see how this is an excellent analog for a future space mission. So when we also have our 3 principles of adaptation, as well as our 6 core assumptions of the extended evolutionary synthesis that we can now use to scaffold the models we build and the assumptions we make to eventually keep people alive. So using these current analogs and these theoretical models, we can put them together to help answer the questions we want. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the expeditions analog because that is my dissertation work. I'm really excited about it. And I'm happy to share some really exciting data that is not published yet, but it will be soon. Okay, so if we go back to our original question, there are lots of different ways to go about this. It's very complex. It's a complex question with complex answers. It is not meant to be a very specific direct question, but you have to just pick up a thread and place it in the correct parameters and just begin to pull. So I'm going to give an evolutionarily relevant way to address how humans can survive and thrive in extreme environments. This is just one of the many ways that we can go to approach this question. So to answer it, first we consider the individual. Now, each individual has various physiological and behavioral systems that are interconnected and act on one another. And when you place that individual in any environment, but particularly an energetically demanding environment like a high altitude environment, there are a series of potent stressors that the body must respond to. However, you very rarely find an individual by themselves. They're usually surrounded by a group of other people, and these other people that they're surrounded by also have their own interacting physiological behavioral systems. Further, these individuals are then all socially connected to each other in unique but potentially important ways. There are potentially many complex ways that these interconnected physiological systems and socially related behavioral dynamics could affect an individual, particularly in an extreme environment. We can look at immune system function, we can look at network analysis, we can look at ecological behavioral patterns, but for right here, for this example, I want to consider these three factors. We have our neuroendocrine systems, metabolic energy expenditure, and social and group dynamics. Okay, so first, let's consider neuroendocrine systems and metabolic energy expenditure. Now, as a biological anthropologist, I am, of course, interested in the evolutionary implications of how energy is used across the life course, life history theory. Energy is a currency that is balanced across different demands. Now, there's a bidirectional relationship between hormones produced by the neuroendocrine system and energy expenditure. So, for example, the hormone cortisol. It plays an important role in determining how energy is allocated. Very simply, it acts as a messenger telling the body what parts need energy. And this is a massive simplification of how cortisol works. But we know that it is produced by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which importantly works on a system of positive and negative feedback loops, responding to stressors in the environment. It's something that is time dependent. You see differences in chronic versus acute cortisol. So for example, how you spend your energy is in a negative feedback loop to overall hormone production. The more intensive activity you're doing and the more energy you're spending, the less energy needs to be diverted to things that don't really matter at that moment, like reproduction or digestion. Now, the neuroendocrine system is also extremely sensitive to social and group dynamics, and this is also in a bidirectional relationship. The hormones are shaping social behavior and overall dynamics, but that then go back and influence your individual hormone levels. Now, colloquially, we know that cortisol is referred to as the stress hormone. And so in a species that is as highly social and cooperative as humans, the HPA's accesses release of cortisol, which was originally part of a fight or flight response and still acts in a fight or flight response in response to predation stress, is now also co-opted to recognize stresses in social relationships, including status threats and feelings of isolation. So cortisol mobilizes psychological resources, including alertness and vigilance and memory sensitization. And we see that higher cortisol levels is associated with increased anxiety, increased social avoidance, and subordinance and isolation, whereas lower cortisol is related to a decreased feelings of perceptions of a stress response. Individual processes related to social and group dynamics may also influence individual energy expenditure. So for example, how much help you can receive on a task. Like I have a lot of friends and they're willing to carry this box with me, so I have to spend less energy to do so. And physiologically, it can also be assisted through changes in hormones, which is something that I was really interested in looking at. And when we think about all of the relevant outcomes, we can also consider physical and mental health or performance. Now, chronic HPA activation and chronically elevated cortisol has negative impacts on memory, depression, and immune function. So when we were talking about before the talk had started about living in this COVID environment, living in this high stress environment, being chronically stressed out all the time is really, really bad for you. It's really bad for the human body. So all of these factors together can impact an individual's physical and mental health, well-being, and overall performance. Okay, so now that we have set the stage, let's look at some actual data. Like how can we actually use real data to see if we can make these connections together? And so to look at how all these factors could help answer our question of how individuals are responding to their environment, I did work with the National Outdoor Leadership School, like Katie had mentioned earlier, which is a wilderness school teaching leadership and survival skills. If anyone gets a chance to take a Knowles course, I recommend it. They're amazing. They are based in Lander, Wyoming, the Rocky Mountain Group, but they have courses that they do all around the world, actually. But for the groups that I worked with, I was specifically looking for individuals that were going on 3-month-long expeditions through the American West. So they started off in Lander, Wyoming, which is the opening to the Winds, which is a mountain range that is connected to the Rocky Mountains. It's very close to Yellowstone, if that helps orient anyone. I don't know if anyone here is very familiar with Wyoming geography, but it's very much in the wilderness and connected to a lot of high altitude regions. Now, during these expeditions, people had to work in small teams and learn how to live in the wilderness while also learning other outdoor skills, including off-trail hiking and mountaineering and canyoneering. And most of them had never done anything like this before. So they are in a novel environment. They are responding to novel skills, novel stressors. And because we were able to capture people right before they went in and after they came out, and they were doing a standardized set of activities for the most part, we were able to create a quasi-experimental setup in a field environment. And so for those of you who are other biological anthropologists, human biologists, you know, that is really hard to do. And so it's an exciting opportunity. And we were able to look at, over the course of a 3-month period, physiology and behavioral shifts that were happening as individuals were acclimatizing to this novel and challenging environment as they faced a unique suite of stressors, which included hypoxic stress, because they are in a high altitude region, cold stress, a novel environment, fixed nutritional availability. They had to take all the food that they wanted in their packs, and that was all the food that they had. Constrained access to resources. They are in the middle of nowhere. Y'all are in Arizona, so you understand the big open nothings that can exist out in the American West. So they were really, it was very limited access to other kinds of resources. They were in a new social group, so they may have known people before, usually not, but now they're stuck with the same people for 3 months. Now, all of these, except for maybe cold stress, is basically exactly relevant to a human spaceflight analog. So we have our model right here. Okay, so back to our original question: how do humans survive and thrive in extreme environments? We can now take this big, complex, large question and make it much, much more specific to ask specifically, when individuals are acclimatizing to an extreme and novel environment, how does something like social and group dynamics influence physiology? So taking into account these intersecting systems approach to how a human body is functioning, how is something like a social and the dynamics of the group impacting individual's function? So for social and group dynamics, it encapsulates individual processes that are happening within the groups themselves. So not necessarily the emergent group properties, but what is happening for the individual themselves. And I had divided this up into 2 categories. So first we have our received and given physical and emotional support, followed by, and then a second category that is individual perceptions related to the experience of the group. Now, the reason we're interested in looking at social support in the first place is that there is the social buffering hypothesis that suggests that greater social support buffers HPA axis response and reduces cortisol and reduces the incidence for negative downstream implications like, for example, cardiovascular disease. And this comes from a long history of looking at social interactions. We as humans have adapted, we have evolved to live in social groups. The rich, robust primate literature out there that talks about the importance of being in the social group and the deep negative implications of being isolated. So that's why we're interested in physical and emotional support, but also because the individual, how they perceive, if they are feeling very stressed, if they're feeling very resilient, if they're feeling included or not, the perceptions are just as important as the actual support that they're receiving. And so the specific perceptions we were looking at was looking at perceived stress as well as resilience. So in this study, we had two hypotheses. One was that, if individuals have greater social support, so the number of people they could count on for social support, they would have lower cortisol. And we actually found that it was not supported at all. But when looking at individual perceptions, our second hypothesis was looking at if individuals report greater resilience and have lower perceived stress, they will also have lower cortisol. So we take the first part looking at perceived stress and cortisol. So on the bottom, you see perceived stress. On the y-axis, you see your pre-cort. So this is your baseline cortisol before they're starting to do any sort of activity. And what we find is that individuals that had greater perceived stress, so they themselves are feeling more stressed out, they had a higher level of baseline cortisol. So this is basically, expected. The stress response is cortisol. So to see this is expected, awesome. We're seeing exactly what we want to see. Now for resilience, we find, so resilience on the x-axis, we have baseline cortisol on the y-axis, and what we find is individuals that self-report across the entire course that they feel more resilient, they have lower cortisol. So they're having a lower stress response from the baseline, from the very beginning. So these are just our hypotheses. We see that the social support is not really bearing out, but individual perceptions is something that is important and interesting. Now, if we take it a step further and want to connect it to energy expenditure, to metabolic and energetic function, and we're looking at resilience and average energy expenditure, how much energy they are spending, what we find is that individuals that have greater resilience, so they feel like they have more resilience, they can respond to tasks better, they feel like they can bounce back from bad situations, they are actually spending more energy overall, potentially because they feel a wherewithal to respond, they feel like they actually can respond. But this was a really interesting finding that we had. So we go back to our original question, what we find is that it's individual perceptions rather than interpersonal support is predicting both cortisol response as well as metabolic function. Metabolic function in this case is how we are measuring how much energy that they're spending. So this example just helps answer just one of the fractions of our questions and helps demonstrate that that there are intersecting systems that are worth paying attention to. It's really, really easy and convenient to just look at one system and look at, okay, how is the system, responding? What are the potential implications? But looking at the intersection is what becomes really important, especially in environments where looking at the intersection can determine if someone will survive or not. The second thing that this example shows is that an evolutionary perspective, so thinking about things like, are humans evolved to be in social groups? Are humans evolved to be supporting each other? Are they does the perception that an individual has, what is the role of that in the evolutionary landscape? So this evolutionary perspective can help place these questions within the appropriate contexts and to help answer questions over multiple timescales and across individuals. But there is so much we don't know. Like I mentioned before, the amount of knowledge that we need to do, the amount of science, the amount of studies that need to happen is massive. In fact, the biggest concern when preparing for a mission to the moon or to Mars, or really any long duration space flight mission, is not the known unknowns. The known unknowns we can deal with, but it's the unknown unknowns. Some examples are, how is human reproduction going to work? How is gestation going to work? How is birth going to work? These are things we don't quite understand. We do have animal models, but we need a more broadened perspective. Another one is, how is long duration spaceflight going to change the immune system? We have an idea. We know that the immune system changes. We know that there's differences on the different kinds of immune responses that you get, but we also see that there are changes that happen in early ISS while the ISS was still under construction that are very different from the changes that happen when the ISS has just been basically a floating lab. So does construction impact how your immune system is responding? What is going to happen when we start extending things over time? Another thing that I think is going to be a hot topic, and I think it already is a hot topic, is looking at the interaction of radiation with the gut microbiome. Is it going to morph? Is it going to mutate any of our gut microbiome? Or something like, how does interpersonal interaction change everyday behavioral practices that'll shift brain structure or stress responsivity, or even something like muscle tone development because people are behaving differently? So I want to encourage everyone to look at the connections between the systems. That is what is key. Now, my talk here is also a call to action. I was telling Katie earlier that you all are my ideal. I'm the most excited to be able to talk to you all. All of this that I'm talking about here could be part of our future understanding if we have the minds to do it. This means increasing diversity and access to who is asking questions and asking the difficult, unique, and theoretically based, but off the wall questions. We need different perspectives to answer these questions. An evolutionary perspective can tell us so much, really, about what is happening and what is bound to happen. Exploring these questions in a human spaceflight environment can do more to also understand to elevate our understanding of what we as a species are capable of. Now, I know that here in Arizona, though I don't know if all of you are physically in Arizona, but I would say that you're all like spiritually in Arizona, maybe. You all appreciate the rigor of human spaceflight and the grit and perseverance an astronaut brings to the table. So congratulations to our newest Arizona Senator, Mark Kelly, who's part of the twin study. He was one half of the twin study. And so I want to leave you with this. It doesn't have to be perfect or the best, just good enough. And this is a tenet that's applicable to evolution and human spaceflight. But if anything, what makes humans special is our capacity to adapt. We are extremely good at making things work. And this is something that we have done and we will continue to do here on Earth and while exploring our cosmos. So I want to thank you all so much. This has been an absolute delight. Also, it takes a village. I think it's really important to acknowledge all of my collaborators, mentors. I have my Knowles folks, my undergrads, my dissertation research team, as well as my new lab here at Hopkins that's helping with me with some of the human spaceflight work. And I am very excited and thrilled to take some questions.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarma. I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, particularly our non-student guests that are here with us today.
Hi, Katie and Mallika. This is Jim.
Hi, Jim.
Listen, this is a really, I hope, lighthearted question, but I giggled when you talked about the unknown unknowns. I was trying to think about whether conceptually that's possible. Don't you know the unknown if you're able to articulate it?
That's a great question, Jim. Also, I'm really happy you're here. So I think philosophically, I don't know the answer to that question. In terms of what the point I'm trying to get across, though, is that, you don't know what you don't know, which is something that my PhD advisor, Lee Gettler, tells me all the time. And that is especially true to human spaceflight. A lot of the things that have emerged are things that no one could even think about. It's like, is this, okay, so here's a really great example. So there is an issue that happens with fluid shifts in the human body. Oh, this is a great opportunity for me to show my next slide, which is about the fluid shifts in the human body. So during microgravity, fluid is shifting away from the legs and up towards the head. So that's something you could possibly expect. You're like, you're in microgravity, you don't have gravity pulling all of your fluids down. You're not pulling your interstitial fluid. You're not pulling your cerebral spinal fluid. You're not pulling blood down. So it makes sense that it's going up to the top of your head. But things that people were not expecting were the potential the structural brain changes that are happening, as well as the flattening of the eye globe, which is whenever I give talks to kids, they get really freaked out about this. They're like, is my eyeball going to explode in space? I'm like, I promise it won't explode. It might get squished a little, but it won't explode. But this is something that people did not even think about, and they just had no idea. And so that's why I'm saying that it's the unknown unknowns that are the most scary, because it's the black swan effect, something that you had not anticipated and then turns out to be catastrophic because of a series of downstream implications, et cetera, which is why it's also important to take a systems approach when looking at these questions, because then you can at least try and anticipate some of these things that might happen.
Great. Very
Thanks,
nice.
Tim.
Thank you, Mallika.
So Mallika, I've got a question for you.
Yes.
So you're talking about these fluid shifts. How does that impact wound healing, or say internal bleeding?
That is a great question. So I know that there are concerns about how rapid wound healing will happen. As of right now, from my knowledge, from my own personal knowledge at least, there have not been any like massive wounds, like open wounds or internal bleeding that has been needed to recover in a spaceflight environment. This is another thing that goes back to the original distance from home. If anything really bad happens, the ISS is actually not that far. The ISS is closer to the Earth's surface than Maryland is to Arizona, actually. And so if they need to get someone back on Earth to do, like if someone gets hurt, if there's internal bleeding, they can do that relatively quickly. But in terms of like, if you're going to Mars, which is like, you're a year and a half away from being able to return, or you can't really turn around, it's like too much fuel, you don't actually know. And so I think that question is going to become much more pertinent. Ben, I'm going to look up the science of the actual microgravity wound healing, because I think that there's definitely going to be something funky going on with fluid dynamics and how that works. I know that like if you puncture yourself, like if you're doing like a blood spot puncture in microgravity, because there's no gravity, the blood will just stick to your hands and like you'll have to like scrape it off. And so thinking about that in terms of like surface dynamics and fluid shifts, I think would be really interesting. I know that there's a really great sci-fi show called The Expanse, and if anyone has watched it or has not watched it, I recommend it. But in this sci-fi show, they talk about fluid or wound healing, and because of the fluid shifts being a major issue. I don't know if that's scientifically sound or not, but I can look that up.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Sylvie has raised her hand. Sylvie, feel free to ask your question.
Thank you for that awesome talk. That was really fascinating. And just what you were saying now about a pinprick and how it sticks to your hand, there's so many things, I guess. You're right about the unknown unknowns, I think. So the question I had was, when you're talking about human reproduction, say in Mars, right? There's a lot of things that we don't know. And one of the things that I was wondering about was the microbiome seeding, because all that you're talking about microbiome is astronauts bringing their microbiome from Earth.
Right.
But a baby born in space is only going to be exposed to the limited amount of microbiome that they're going to be exposed, that is there, right?
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that? Like, are we going to transport lots of microbiomes into space to make sure that we have a diversity there?
So my thoughts on that, I think that we're going to have to, or people are going to be like, well, we'll just see what happens if there is going to be a pregnant person that is comfortable being pregnant in space and giving birth on Mars, and they're willing to take the risks. So the microbiome question is in the long schema of spaceflight science, I think is a relatively recent one. And people are now realizing it is extremely important and something we really, really need to be thinking about. I think that from, like, if you were to just give birth to a baby in a Martian environment, a strictly sterile environment, I think could have some serious negative implications. Even like Martian soil actually has toxins that might be problematic to a baby too. So it's not like you can just take it or terraform or whatever. I think they would be much more complicated. I think that some sort of microbiome transference, carrying it with you, is something that would have to be considered, or building a new microbiome environment in this built environment is something that is another possibility, which actually might actually be more reasonable because you can only take so much stuff with you. Like, you also have the engineering constraints, right? You have to use this for rocket fuel, so you can only take so much other stuff. Microbiome is small and probably pretty cheap to bring with you, but I don't know, maybe people are going to be bringing fecal bags of something, so they're like, we can be able to replicate a microbiome environment. Yeah, Katie.
I want to follow up on that.
Yeah.
Fantastic question and answer. With so one of the things that we run into a lot of times in maternal and child health is due to for example, American exceptionalism and white supremacy. There's this idea that the industrialized European extraction population in North America that is, overwhelmingly the best studied, is baseline.
Yes.
And yet we know that our industrialized food production and our extensive use of antibiotics and monocultures of our food and all sorts of things have basically shaped a really weird microbiome. Yes. And so are people in NASA kind of increasingly aware that what they think of as baseline is actually fundamentally perturbed, and that we need to be actually modeling a different kind of thing in order to be potentially buffering people's, poor health outcomes? We can use microbes as an example here, but of course that's not the end of the list. Is there starting to be greater understanding of an adaptively relevant environment and how to replicate that? And it's not just trying to get it as close to what it's like in Maryland, as one might think some non-evolutionary scientists might knee-jerk think.
That is a great question, Katie. So I can't answer for every microbiome scientist. I think one thing that's really fantastic about a lot of the work that's done at Human Research Program is that they do solicit a lot of work from everyone, as long as people know about it. I think that's one of the major issues. A lot of people just don't know about it. And so there is a chance that we have some of the people that are submitting that are doing studies that have these perspectives. I am not sure how prevalent it is. From my understanding, it is not as common of a viewpoint as I feel like it should be. It is, and that's not even just for microbiome. I think it's like for a lot of the different physiological aspects, basing it on an strictly American population, American white population. And if we really get down to the center of it, it's like, the OG astronaut corps, which was all white, tall fighter pilots that were all type A, very aggressive, competitive people. Like, at least now people understand that you don't want to have 6 of those guys all going to Mars together because someone will get murdered. Definitely. You definitely need to have a good variety. So at least there's that understanding. From a physiological understanding, I think that there's a lot of work to be done on that. Okay. Something that I, as an anthropologist, I'm really hoping to bring to the table. I know that if I had to take a microbiome with me, I would 100% take the microbiome of my friends in Congo, because they're much more robust than I was living in my tiny house in Indiana. But I think that is a real concern. And I also think, this is just my personal opinion, but I feel very strongly about it, kind of human spaceflight was very nationalistic. We're going to historically, it was very, very nationalistic, coming out of the Cold War, the US versus the USSR at the time. And with the ISS, it has become increasingly more international. And that is the way it should be, because these perspectives, having an international perspective, means that you can do better work, like addressing things like, maybe we shouldn't have, you know, people who like live in office buildings every day and are like, you know, have never experienced the outside world be the model for your microbial standards, because it could cause problems. Or just basically, maybe we should talk to women about female reproduction. I mean, there's a really famous story about when Sally Ride was going to space, the engineers gave her like, I think it was like 1,000 tampons. And she was like, guys, I'm going not for that long. I definitely don't need 1,000 tampons. So, I mean, just like the diversity of perspectives is so critical to being able to do this kind of science.
Yeah. I mean, what did it say though, that I think of it as a win that the technicians were like, oh, women menstruate, we should plan for that.
Right? At least they realized that.
Yeah. All right. So we are now at the top of the hour. So everybody join me again in thanking Dr. Sarma, and wonderful talk, wonderful, wonderful thought-provoking considerations. And so students, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we will come back and we'll have our student discussion. Okay.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Everybody be well. Take care.
All right, take care.